Okay, the recording. I'm not going to repeat myself, but let's get started. The issue of editor recognition is something that I put on the agenda when I was elected to chair the Scholarly Publication Committee about 18 months ago. I'm editing two international journals, or co-editing now two international journals that I both founded, one of which started on a golf ball typewriter in my office at Wits University. I've been able to see how things have changed both within universities and with regard to the global publishing industry, which has grown massively during that period, and which is one of the reasons why we're meeting regularly now, because just trying to keep up with technological and financial and copyright and university policies and incentives and what have you has been just extraordinary. And I was really pleased when I raised the issue 18 months ago that Philip de Jager had very similar feelings to myself. I think he edits two journals, and he picked up this particular point and has run with it. The first report back was last year when we, as I mentioned yesterday, had a session on editing as fun and why editing is becoming less fun as we have to negotiate all these bureaucratic, technological, financial, legal, poppy, and other issues that keep getting in our way in a world that is becoming increasingly litigious. So how do we actually restore the fun into the editing process? And I think most editors who have spoken over the past few days have indicated that they do enjoy what they're doing and they will continue what they're doing and even continue peer reviewing. I think that's brilliant. But we still have the hurdle that we have to deal with our own universities, which would prefer that we were writing articles and publishing them rather than enabling other people to get published. So I'm going to hand over to Philip as the first speaker, who will update us on the discussions over the past year and take us into the future. Philip, over to you. Philip, we can't hear you.
Better?
Yes, we got.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to share the stage with Caroline and with Kian and Labby that I'm going to be meeting. Yes, so my presentation is mostly to give you feedback, but I'm also using it as an opportunity for me to start getting some thoughts together on how to get this work published. If you just bear with me, I'll share my screen.
While we're bearing with you, I see that I've usurped Carolyn as the facilitator. I'm getting all sorts of instructions on my email from the NSEF office. Carolyn, sorry about that. Can I hand over to you?
Not at all, Kenyan. You've done a brilliant job. So I think we can just proceed with Philip's presentation. Thank you.
Okay. But would you like to carry on from here as the facilitator?
I will do so. Thanks.
Please do. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that.
Yes, so I'm titling my talk, or it's been titled for me, Struggles Faced by Editors of Journals in South Africa, just by, association there. I'm first of all doing this based on my association with the Committee on Scholarly Publishing in South Africa, but I'm also from UCT. So my introduction, this presentation is a result of a discussion we had last week, or last year at this event. Just reminding you about that. It was in the minutes, and Kian is my shock yesterday when I joined. I could just hear Kian starting to mention my name and involving me. But we were discussing, unpacking the question of whether or not research can be fun. And it was a panel discussion. Caroline was nice enough to be on the panel, and I had Warren Maroon on the panel as well. And then there was Kian on the panel. And we threw some thoughts around. I think there's general agreement that for this to be a sustainable exercise, it needs to be fun. But some of the discussion points that came through last year. Issues such as a research community, and being at the southern point of Africa, it's often a small community, but also what came through, for it to be fun, there's a sense of purpose that's needed in what we do. You can see there, I'm saying underlying this, why I had this discussion, there's a classic question. I'll come back to the classic question. I just want to give you a summary of what's happening. So as a committee and as the Academy of Science of South Africa, we want to support a vibrant and sustainable journal ecosystem. It needs to be fun. But that classic question needs to be answered as well. How am I, and I think I can speak on behalf of the committee at the moment, I haven't had alternative suggestions, but how are we going to support this lofty goal? Well, we're working on an NSEF statement. I'm going to give you feedback on that statement. But then the idea is for a two-pronged approach. So the statement, and if we can get that under the noses of our university administrators and at performance appraisal time, that'll be very useful. But I think a two-punch approach, following up this NSEF statement with a survey of you as a group. And what do I want to accomplish with a survey? It's to set benchmarks there. So when your manager at the performance appraisal says, yes, but don't tell me you edit a journal, tell me about your activities. Imagine if you've got benchmarks, and for those benchmarks, I want to hear your experiences and how long things take you, etc. So that's my plan. So getting back to the classic question, if we're having fun, the classic question is always, who's going to pay for it? And that's really what we're going to be doing in this talk. So my starting point was after the meeting last year, was first to analyze the minutes of the meeting. And it's useful about these online meetings. It's not just about what's being said and what's on the screen, but it's also the chat. So I had full access to everything that was in the chat, and I allocated it to these different categories. And these are really the categories I used to make sense of what was found in the minutes. And very clearly what came through is there was an issue with work done by editors, that it's not acknowledged by universities and by line managers. Then it was raised as well that in the journal environment, there's a lack of financial resources that, the university gets the money for the papers published by their academics, but then how does that flow into the journal ecosystem? So there was a bit of a discussion on that. Then, as expected, what came through was also the problem of finding reviewers for all papers. And there was lastly a bit of a discussion around the purpose of especially South African journals, but the purpose of academic journals in general, and let's call it South African journals. And the answer was pretty much given in the discussion, that there's a lot of value added by the editing function, not just language and grammar value, but also in terms of establishing a research ecosystem or a research grouping, a sense of belonging, and a sense of purpose to a certain research endeavor. The rest of this talk will focus on is the issue that was mostly raised and that I then cherry-picked out of my analysis of the minutes, and that is this issue of the acknowledgement of work done by editors. So next, we're just looking at a few of the examples of this acknowledgement issue. Amusing, look there at the end, GPL's speaking about his line manager thinking that be an editor, you can quickly pull it all together on a Saturday between 2 rugby matches. But as you can see on the screen, recognition is an issue. And as NSEF and as the Committee on Scholarly Publishing, want to support you in getting the recognition that you deserve, but also recognizing that that recognition is
Philip, there's a lot of dropouts on your microphone. Perhaps you could get closer to your computer.
I'm gonna.
Much better.
It's previously been an issue on Zoom, so I'm just gonna get rid of the headset.
Right. It's now perfect. Thank you.
I hope that's going to be better. But yeah, this gives you an idea from the type of comments that we received that being an editor of a journal, it's not being recognized by our university system. It's not by being recognized by line managers. And as the Committee on Scholarly Publishing and as NSEF, we want to support you in that important work because we think the sustainability of the system depends on it. What was interesting also in the discussion this morning is this idea that knowledge and research findings, that they are public goods. Now, from economics, the problem with public goods is you can't exclude anybody from using them, but who pays for them? So it gets back to this question again. You know, if we're having fun as editors, who's going to pay for us to have fun? So as part of the fun, I just thought I'll give you a little bit of a Dilbert idea. So I'll leave that up for a few moments, just take a look. I think it is quite relevant to us as a university when we think about performance appraisal of research activities and performance appraisal of editing activities. So who's going to pay for it? I want to suggest that mostly universities should pay for it. And it's because there's goal congruence. And unique to South Africa, the goal congruence between what we're doing as editors, what we're doing as individual academics, and what the university is about is on two levels. The accountants will love the fact that what we're doing as editors, it supports the university in getting in money, but we're also supporting the university in this knowledge project, the original purpose of the university. So coming back to the Dilbert comic on the previous slide, you know, it's this dual purpose, you know, is it the money or is it our objectives, our vision that we're going for? And I think as academics, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but thinking about Sean Miller's presentation yesterday, I think to a certain extent, he was saying it shouldn't be about the money. It should be about this academic project. So goal congruence, the university should pay because they're worried about the academic project and about making money. And we've got this unique circumstance with our subsidy scheme in South Africa, where both of these are dependent to a large extent on the editing function and on the journal ecosystem. I went and I looked at a little bit of literature on, and this is very much little bit, but just what do they say, you know, what's the purpose of academic journals? So I put a few down there on the left-hand side. Scholarly communication, filter for errors, the peer review system, keep record of advances, communicate what's going on. But then also very important, and I separated from the other three, there's also this idea of group formation, that often a scientific breakthrough is not just a single, you know, flash that hit an individual, but it could be like a whole grouping that deviates from the mainstream. So that's pretty much standard. But then I listened to the talks at this National Scholarly Editors Forum, and it made me think. It made me think about the purpose of African journals and specifically South African journals. And I just want to add to this some more thoughts. Well, what can we bring to the party? I think all of these points are now raised in the block. They do hang together. But what was raised by Alice yesterday is this idea of helicopter science. And for me, it speaks a lot to this traditional purpose of maybe having African journals or South African journals, and that is that they're closer to the local context. They can speak to the context a lot better. And I think that comes together with this idea of not being helicopter scientists and actually involving the community and being closer to the community. And then something that I want to link together with a few of the talks that I heard is this idea of speaking truth to power. And yes, I'm using terminology kind of from the South African context, but it's also about just calling out the emperor if the emperor has got no clothes on. That's the idea. And I think it links with what Nasipu spoke about yesterday, the ideas around freedom of speech, the ideas around freedom of thinking, then reflecting on what Sean was speaking about and his ideas that with the incentives that are in place in the scientific infrastructure, including this subsidy scheme in South Africa, but how it's become something different than what is being aimed for. And that often he's got this terminology, and I might be abusing it, but he called it facsimile science. And I think as South African journals, we've got a role to play. Often we will contain facsimile science, but we also create space. We create space for that non-conforming thoughts, non-conforming findings. And I think it ties with what Pierre de Villiers also spoke about this morning with his example of a recent paper that they've published in AOSIS. And just this idea of herd forming in the scientific process and how we, as standing a little bit outside the mainstream, in that sense, how we create space for alternative ideas, for creating space. So I think all of those things, I don't want to philosophize too much now about the purpose of academic journals, but I think there's a nice overlap there. We are critically involved as editors of journals, as journals, in the creation of new knowledge, in the academic process, but we're also critical in earning money for the university. So there's definitely goal congruence here. And my suggestion is, and I think that's why we're coming up with a statement, we want the universities to pay for these activities because they get most of the benefits. So what are we doing as a committee? Well, we're first working on a statement from NSEF, and the three of us have been working on it, Leslie Swartz, Robin Crew, myself. We've compiled the statement. It has gone to the committee. The committee is not yet happy with it. So a list of corrections has been, it's almost like a review process. So we've received the list of corrections required, and we will now be responding to those corrections. Most of them will be implemented, and a corrected version will be presented to the committee. And I'm hoping that eventually we'll convince them to accept it as a committee. And from the committee, the statement will then go to the NSEF board. The timing of the board meeting is in February next year. So I'm hoping to get the statement through the committee to the NSEF board February next year. And then I can't speak for the NSEF board, how quick they would work on this. But let's say we're aiming to get this out as a statement middle 2023. So what is in the statement is really just speaking to the academic infrastructure, academic managers, saying that this is important, reminding them about the academic project and about the money that flows from editing functions and journals, and then making a few specific suggestions, things like it needs to go into the performance appraisals, things like to be a professor, it should be expected that you have been editor of a journal. Something along those lines. I'm hoping to get the statement finished by June 2023. Then, with the double punch approach, we'll follow that up with a survey of you. And I'm hoping, and as a committee, we kind of agreed on this, we're hoping that we can then use that survey and turn it into a paper. What's the purpose of the survey? To set benchmarks for editing activities within the South African context. So some of the ideas for the survey, just some of the questions, and this is really where feedback from you would be much appreciated. But first of all, just trying to establish, so who has got, of the universities, who has got editing of journals and performance appraisal criteria, and exactly where do they have it? We also, as part of this exercise, want to support reviewing, as seeing that as integral part of the journal process. Where is it included? Exactly, how much credit do you get for it? I'm just using my knowledge here of the UCT performance appraisal system. So I'm asking the question, so being an editor in your editing activities, is it a research activity or is it a social responsibility activity? Now, I do have some thoughts, but the idea here is to gather both thoughts and numbers so that we can say, on average, this is what's happening in the market. So if you're at a university that deviates from the average, then at least you've got an argument. Then I want to map out in the survey all of the standard activities that an editor engages in. And I want to split those activities between activities that are volume driven. In other words, volume, I'm thinking number of papers, and activities that are not volume driven. And then especially for the paper driven or the volume driven activities, establish some benchmark. So to, make everybody think, now to process one paper, what does it take? What type of time commitment is required for one paper? Now, if you then go, as an editor, go back into your journal for the year, when it comes to performance appraisal, and you look at, oh, I dealt with 200 papers this year, then it's very easy for you to turn that into how long would that have taken me. I also think that with the new tools, the new internet tools that's become available, we can make review activity also much more visible now in academic performance appraisals. You can now put numbers to it. So maybe some of the questions is just around expectations. If you're a lecturer, if you're a senior lecturer, what are the different levels of expectations of your involvement in the field? I raised that question again about how important is being an editor of a journal for your standing as an academic and being recognized in the field as a researcher. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts. And that's the survey. So in conclusion, it strongly came through at this discussion at last year's Nationally Scholarly Editors Forum that editors are under the impression, and are correctly so, that the universities, our universities, are not really supporting those functions. And the editors feel they put a lot of time into it, and they need more recognition for the work that they're doing. Of course, we all know that universities make money out of the papers that get published, but also we need to remind universities of that, but also that part of the purpose of the university is this knowledge project that we're working together on. And I think there it would be nice in a paper to highlight the specific advantages that we've got. We often think that not being maybe in Northern Hemisphere based and being where the big close to the big journals, we often see that as a disadvantage, and to a large extent it can be, but being removed from them has also got advantages, and I think we should play to those advantages. So How are we going to support that? We're going to support you, first of all, with an NSEF statement. And the statement should be something that you can present to your managers and to managers at the top of the university, but also managers when it comes to your performance appraisal. And then we'll follow that up with a survey. The purpose of the survey is more to establish benchmarks. You know, how do the others do it? So if my performance appraisal doesn't give me credit for my editing role, how can I make an argument? What are the standards? So that's the purpose with the survey, and hopefully with those two combined, we'll move in the direction that is needed, that came out at last year's forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was a very brilliant talk. I particularly enjoyed how you weaved in your thoughts with what others had said previously. I can see the chat's already quite active. There are a lot of reactions to you, but we will keep with our agreed run of play, which is to allow Labi to make his presentation, and then we'll have the discussion, because our fear is that once we dig in right now, time will run away with us. So please hold on to your questions. We'll bring them back at the end. Labi, whilst you're getting ready to screen share, I'll just say to colleagues in the room that we're not going to do the official introduction of you or Philip, because your reputations precede you. You're very active and well-known members of the community. So I trust people do know who you are, but do take, if you like, a few seconds at the start to introduce yourself to those who may not know you. Over to you, Labi, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So I'm Labi Ramrathan from the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Just to say that I have taken over the editorship of the Journal of Education just this year, but I have been for a few years now the co-editor of the Springer series on Key Thinkers in Education and of the Alternation African book series as well. So what I'm presenting today is basically my experience of being thrust into the position of an editor and the things that I had to grapple with in order to get a sense of what it means to be an editor. And as such, begin to share some of my thoughts about how we can support editors to become efficient and to run a journal that is of high quality. So basically, I'm just going to give a quick introductory comments. I know time is going, it's the last presentation, so I'm not going to take too much of your time and just to engage with, go straight into the presentation. So some of my introductory comments, becoming an editor of a journal. So one begins to try and understand, how does one become a journal editor? And for me, it was being part of an engagement and part of the Journal of Education as a editorial committee member. But that was just for the Journal of Education. But in the other ones, it was being recognized for the work that you do as a scholar, as a researcher, and as a publisher. And so I was invited to be part of the editorial teams for the other publication houses. So I think it's important to recognize that if you are wanting or aspiring to become an editor of a journal, credibility is an important consideration. Your presence as a scholar and a researcher and as an author is also very important. Because those are the things that will bring weight to your editorial stance at the journal. Initially, it's an excitement of being recognized as someone who would be able to lead a journal, but soon that excitement actually disappears. And that the reality dilemma begins to emerge when you start the process of editing and begin to understand the amount of work, the daunting task, the accountability issues that you have to really play up to and so forth. So that excitement soon disappears and the reality of work in the journal emerges. And I think that requires a substantial engagement with your workload as an academic, as being part of a university. So there has to be a reorganization of your workload. And so if you conceptualize as your time as being kind of 8 to 4 or 6 to 8 person, that's not going to work, because this is over and above the almost 1,800 hours that you have to spend as an academic, teaching, research, and supervision and community engagement. So being a journal, it's a way of life as well. And so we need to begin to understand that our workload should not be the constraint of becoming an editor, that we have no bounds in terms of times. Obviously, you need to create times for your family and your other commitments and so forth, but you can't have a strict organization of time in terms of scheduling and so forth. So it's a way of life that we have to embrace. The accountability issues are substantial. There's accountability up, meaning that if your journal is part of a professional organization or a university or any other funding agency, there's always issues around accountability up. There's accountability to the team. If you are basically within an editorial team, you have to account to the team that's working with you. And obviously accountability is a two-way process. So the team is also accountable to you as well. There's accountability authors. And I think you've heard through the presentation that authors, when they submit the papers, they want almost immediate response. They want a response saying that the journal has been, the article has been accepted. So they want acknowledgement of the acceptance of the article, and then they track the process. And so if you within 2 weeks or 3 weeks have not met your activities in submission, you will have to you'll get comments, emails, and so forth saying that the paper has moved from its position, So accountability to authors emerge, and you have to respond to those things. And obviously, there's accountability to the readers and the scholars, because they are the recipients of the knowledge that's supposed to be contained in it. And so we have to be careful about what gets published, in what format it gets published, and what are the key, and how it actually fits into the different discourses and debates that are unfolding within a particular field. So accountability to readers is also a very important consideration as being part of the editor. I think the scope of the journal is somewhat quite central to what we do, because quite often we receive articles that may not necessarily be within the scope of the journal. And so this is where the first kind of reviews takes place. Is it in line with the scope of the journal? Now, in order to do that, you really have to have a deep sense of what the scope of the journal is, not just in terms of what's been written, because what's been written is possibly a paragraph or two, but how does that paragraph or two expand into the scholarship world, into the research domain, in terms of knowledge infrastructure that's available? So just not having, just having a brief understanding of what's written is not sufficient as the scope of the journal. We need to understand its implications, its links, its interrelationship with other knowledge fields, other domains, other geographical contexts, and so forth. So for me, I had to understand beyond just the text. And I think when I got into being an editor of the Journal of Education, I had to introspect to say, what am I bringing to this journal as an editor? Am I just going to follow what has been done? Is there opportunities for me to create an identity of myself as an editor through the work that I do, through the kind of engagements that I have with all of these accountability structures? How can I make this journal a living thing? So it's not just a follow-on of the traditions and so forth. There's lots of changes that are unfolding, and how does one begin to start thinking about introducing some of the changes to bring new directions and new perspectives. And obviously you cannot take a unilateral decision on this, but to actually put in ideas and concepts and new ways of thinking to the editorial committee, to the editorial board, and so forth. So it's important then to understand also who are the editorial team members and editorial boards, so that you'll be able to engage with them in a substantive way, so that you are having a journal that is current, that is forward-looking, and that is responding to the issues that are unfolding constantly. I think one of the biggest challenges that I had as a editor of the journal is that we have, waves of publication in a particular area, a particular focus area, like, for example, COVID-19. And because I'm in education and the journal is Journal of Education, we had almost a cloudburst of articles around the same topic, saying different things, some of them saying different things, but a lot at the descriptive level and so forth. And so the question that is, how do we begin to engage with waves of publication? And when and how do we see that the waves need to come to an end, so that we begin to create opportunities for new things, new way of thinking, new ideas, and so forth. So these were some of my introductory dilemmas that I faced as a journal beyond excitement. So also being the editor of the journal, our journal is an open, it's an open access journal, and it's an online publication. So we moved into the online publication process. And so as an editor, you cannot just rely on technical assistance to understand the online system. I had to know the system intimately, because the queries will come to you. And so part of my training and development was to know the platform, the online platform on which the submissions are made, the review processes are unfolding, and the decisions that are made ultimately to the point where the copy editing processes take place, and finally the publication of it. So knowing all of these phases of the review process from receipt to publication is an important aspect of my development as an editor. So knowing the system also requires me to be able to problem solve, to be able to navigate the online system in ways that I can identify quickly the issues, so that you don't only rely on technical support, that you can provide firsthand and first line of response to queries. So problem solving is always a big issue around that. And I think the online platforms are so tentative that the updates are emerging almost on a monthly basis or 6 monthly basis and so forth. And so we have to keep in touch with the updates and how we can be able to update the platform in a way that the technical updates are happening. So right now we're sitting with the system that is, I think, 4 versions outdated. And so that's a problem. And so updating, it's also a costly affair, and it does create financial challenges to journals, especially those that have open access journals that have a minimal APC charges. So part of my engagement as an editor is that I believe that I should read almost every article that is submitted. And so I think the earlier speaker spoke about maybe 200 articles being received or more. So the journal that I work with actually receives more than 200 articles. It's almost impossible to read these articles in any depth. And so I had to find a way of managing my reading process. And so if I look at the scope of the journal, as well as what the article is saying. I should be able to very quickly indicate whether the article is located within the focus of the journal. I can look at and see whether ideas are being built up or extended, or it's a critique of papers published in the journal. And this is the reason why I read all the articles, is that I need to know what the journal publishes and how new articles emerge do contribute to the development of the discourse and the debates that are unfolding within a particular focus area or school. A recency of information, I mean, we get a lot of articles being published in 2022, for example, that has 2010 and 1990 references, while we acknowledge that there are seminal works that are important. But when you find a whole lot of your literature being presented is so outdated, it becomes a concern. I also look for articles that are dealing with topical issues, that are current issues, they are national, global, and sectorial interests and attention. And we also look at innovations in ideas, methodologies, and context. So these are some of the things that I quickly look at to determine whether, in fact, the article should go forward or not. The next thing that I have to deal with as a editor is that once the article has gone out for reviews and it comes back, how do we manage the reviewers' comments? And we've noted that some of the reviewers' comments are quite harsh. Sometimes they don't speak to the issues that have been presented in the paper, they speak to the author. They provide comments that are personal in nature and so forth. So part of my responsibility as an editor is to begin to look at what has been presented by the reviewers. So we don't just accept the reviewers' comments. We look at how the reviewer has responded to, for example, the title and purpose, the coherence and clarity, the development of the paper, adequacy and recency, and so forth. So these are some of the things that gives you first-line engagement with an article, with the review comments, so that you are able to see and mediate the comments between the reviewer and the author. And I think it's extremely important for us as editors to take this aspect of it seriously in the context that our reviewers do the review on voluntary basis, but the authors also need the support, guidance, the care for development, noting that there is a growing early career researchers group that we need to harness and support as they begin to carve the journeys in research publications. So when I am looking at an article, I just can't read the article. And I think someone spoke about reviewing the article earlier on and what do they do and how long they do. So I actually do the same. Very quickly, a backward mapping process that I follow. Just get a sense of what the purpose of the article is, the 2 or 3 things the person is saying in the articles, determine how they have arrived at these 3 or 4 things, look at the methodology, evidence, and so forth. Now, these are the things that I use as framing questions in an article as I read through the article, because I need to do speed reading. And if I have this frame that guides my reading process, then I'll be able to determine whether, in fact, we should be able to then send this for further processing or not. And if you can immediately find out or find through this process that the article has not been substantially developed, then this is the point where we say, hang on, go back and attend to these things. Because we can't give our reviewers articles to review where we think there is substantive issues that need to be addressed. And these quick things helps me to determine that. I think I also need to pay attention to academic writing. While we have issues, while we have support in terms of editorial support before it's get published, but a very quick, as you read through, Look at sentence construction, paragraph construction, subsections, strong and weak arguments, types of evidence, and so forth. And very quickly be able to establish whether these things emerge or these things are taken care of in the article. So as you can see, just being an editor is not just simply receipt of articles and submitting it through the process. It's a whole lot of things that needs to happen. The administration of the journal is also quite important. Data metrics, keeping track of the key metrics like submissions, downloads, citations, author frequencies. A lot of these data metrics is really related to accountability things, but it also helps us to locate our journal in terms of the knowledge spectrum and how we're contributing and where we're contributing and how we can actually begin to shape and change the scope and focus of the journal in ways that we will contribute more substantially to the knowledge production system and dissemination of information. I think as editors, we also need to keep track of the finances in terms of the cost of publishing, copy editing, and the administrative and support. It is not possible for the editor to do all of these things, but at least keep track of them and be able to use them in decision-making processes. The review challenges, yes, we have a whole lot of reviewers available, but there are concerns which has been raised in previous presentations about the experience, relevance of knowledge base, and emerging scholar exposure to the discourse of reviewing, as well as the discourse of the field in which the article is focusing its engagement with. Time delays in reviewing manuscripts, even though the reviewers have agreed to do the review in time, 2-3 reminders, they still do not submit the review reports, and this delays the process. And so we have to begin to think about how and what timeframes we should be able to give a reviewer to then comment on the article that they have received. And I think one of the big challenges that I've noticed is that when an article has been submitted, after the review comments have been addressed, to what extent we check on the revised version? Do we rely on the schedule of changes that have been made, or do we read the article to see whether in fact the comments have been addressed sufficiently enough for the paper to be now published? It's all time consuming, it is challenging, it's a big issue. And so some of my parting thoughts are that if you want to become an editor of a journal, you should actually be part of an editorial committee or be part of an assistant editor before becoming an editor, so that you understand the complexities, what's required, and so forth. So it shouldn't be that you're nominated as an editor and then be able to then take on the editor position with little experiences on editing. And so I think part of the NSEF review report on the review of journals is to understand how editors become editors and what criteria are used in the selection process to become editors. And I think we really need to present this, not just amongst the editors of the journals, but it should be part of institutions as they begin to look at the workload, the community engagement of its staff, their performance, and so forth, so that they build a cohort or a pool of editors that can step into editorship. If you're an editor, you need to be an active researcher. I indicated credibility before, and I think being an active researcher, scholar, is an important attribute, so that your presence needs to be felt in your publications as well. You've earned the credibility institutionally and within the research community, because that goes to issues around the worth of the journal. Work collaboratively, especially in decision-making related to complex issues, and don't rush to conclusions in complex issues. And I think finally, which I don't support too much, but perhaps we should begin to introduce short courses for editors, especially in the different areas that I've mentioned. We don't have to create accredited short courses. There are so many platforms in which we can create activities for developing editors, and I think NSEF needs to take that responsibility of going forward. I'd like to stop here at this point and take in any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Labi. The chat actually has been engaging to some extent with what both you and Philip have been saying. So I think one way to deal with this would be to give Philip maybe 2 minutes just to engage with some of the chat messages that have been going on. So Labi has a minute or two as well to see what's been going on in the chat. And thereafter, I think anyone is welcome to actually put their hand up and take the mic and actually share any comments or questions that they may have. So Philip, do you want to say anything about the steady stream of comments and questions that you've been receiving in the chat?
Caroline, you've put me on the spot there, but yeah, I think what's been coming through is there's some variation amongst institutions, and part of coming out with this NSEF statement and then following that up with a survey result is also to give the various institutions sight of what's going on in the market. So for example, I can see the one comment there about editors actually getting a financial or getting payment from their institution for the editing function. That would be interesting for those institutions that think this is something you can do in the afternoon between watching rugby on TV. So I think it confirms some of that. Some of the other comments, there was a comment there as well, responding to me saying that universities should bear the cost. Maybe what I should clarify is my argument is really that universities should bear the human time cost. I think it's natural for them to encourage their academics to pursue and build this infrastructure that we all use. But the comment made is that publishers also, take some of the money out of the system and get some of the benefit. So I don't have deep thoughts on that. I know Kian has been thinking about it and writing on it. So maybe that'll be Kian's contribution into the thinking on the committee. And yeah, so in summary, I think there's a wide variety of how the editing function is being dealt with by institutions in terms of performance appraisal and evaluation. And that is part of the reason why having a perspective on average what is happening, I think would be useful. It just gives you a benchmark. So as an academic, then you've got something to refer back to base your argument for. I'm actually working when I'm editing the journal rather than I'm having fun. You might be having fun, but it's working fun. Thank you.
100%. Thanks, Philip. So there were a few other comments in the chat about the survey and what people thought should go in there. I think all of those are taken on board and you will engage with them as you go forward. And so, Labi, I want to hand over to you for a minute or two to engage with what's been said in the chat. When you were speaking, I thought that as you engaged with who and what an editor is, you were actually talking about how to be an editor, how to do the job well, and how to learn to be better at the job. So I actually wrote down to be, to do, and to learn. Quite a lot that is required of editors. And so there have been some comments here, particularly about, that bit about the doing. and you said that you would read all of the submissions to your journal. That's quite a job. That's a lot. And so there was some agreement with that. And then, of course, you also highlighted challenges, including reviewer challenges, and there's also been engagement with that. And not really direct questions, but I wondered if perhaps someone wanted to actually pose a direct question in addition to those comments that I have just summarized or read out to Labby. Otherwise, Labby, we would be very keen to hear how you have been this awesome editor, you know, how you've done the being, the doing, and the learning. And of course, you spoke about capacity at the end, about courses and things like that. So a little bit more, if you will, your own personal experience.
Well, I think for me, I have to develop speed reading. I do a lot of workshops on writing for publications across several institutions and within a whole lot of spaces that I do. So I do a lot of, you know, those kinds of workshops and so forth. So I had to find ways in which I was able to identify the key elements that I could pick up very quickly on reading an article. So as I was studying, you know, my professor itself said, initially you will start reading an article. It'll probably take you about 2 hours to read an article to get a deeper sense of what it means. You need to aspire to read an article within 20 minutes. And so that's what I've begun to train myself to do. And therefore, I prefer that to read the articles, not just because I want QA, but also to see the kinds of articles that we're receiving and how we can organize it in terms of the publication that will unfold, in terms of the issues that emerge as well. So those are some of the things that I have learned. But as I indicated, journal articles, submissions to journals are increasing substantially. Articles are coming from all corners of the world. And so initially we used to have about 100 to 120 articles that I've been submitting, but over the last year we had more than 200 articles. And therefore the editorial committee is an important committee to help with that process. But I think the pre-screening of articles, for me, is absolutely crucial, whether it's done by you as an editor or part of the editorial team.
I would agree, Labby, 100%. My eyes are very quickly scrolling the screen to see if anyone would like to actually speak in addition to those comments that we've got. I wondered then, between the two of you, having listened to your different takes, if perhaps you had an immediate response, Labby, to what Philip said, or Philip, if you've got an immediate response to what Labby said. If anything comes to mind, please share.
Thanks, Caroline. Labby, I'm gonna take it. My immediate response is just based on my experience and observations, and then perhaps you, Labby, can help me to understand better what's going on. So one of the journals I'm involved in is in the business school community. There's an Australian Business Deans Council that does a journal rating. It's like a quality rating. And then there's also a UK version. So this journal that I'm involved in, it was re-ranked. You know, it went from a lower down on the quality list, probably in the lowest quality category, to the second highest quality category. And of course, in that process, suddenly your submissions jump up. So how the journal dealt with it was really to split the work. So there's still only one editor that's the first receiving point for any new paper that comes in. But then the associate editor pool was substantially expanded. And so I think what that editor does is not go through the type of detail that you're going through, Labby, but more just look for whether this is aligned with the journal's purpose and what associate editor is best positioned to deal with that paper. So the real, let's call it, the deeper, more complicated test rejection decision is then left to the associate editor. But I was wondering, you know, when do you make this decision to expand your team? And do you do that in anticipation? Do you wait for the volumes to kind of put you in a place where you don't have another option? What would you suggest?
Well, for me, it's two things. The first one is that, you mentioned when the journal moved from a lower level to the higher level. I've noticed this, the moment we became Scopus listed, that's when we get a whole flood of international submissions. Yet the journal is focused a lot on South African education issues, but there's a whole lot of articles that come in. In terms of the when and how you begin to expand, so initially, when you start looking at the articles that are coming, you look at the range. Well, education is quite a multidisciplinary area. And so you have to try and begin to think about what is the trend of publications in a particular field of education or focus area of education, and be able to be flexible in how you begin to kind of recruit people. So you have to work with the editorial team, you have to work with the editorial board to say there will be some decisions of inclusions into this. Fortunately, the Journal of Education is part of the South African Educational Research Association. So I have access to over 500 memberships of the association. And so we use that kind of a pool of people, and our engagement with the membership of CIDA is quite substantive and ongoing. So we know generally who the people are who would be able to contribute sufficiently. And so we recruit that, not just as a fixed period, but on an ongoing basis. And that helps a lot. So that level of flexibility is important.
Thank you very much. Before Kenyan runs us off the stage, we're almost at time. Betty had a hand up, so let's take Betty's question or comment.
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Chair. I would like the views of Profs. Ramrathan and Diaga on, if one man wants to manage the volumes of submissions that we get throughout the year, what do you think of limiting the window period within which an editor can receive submissions? So, for example, I have 2 issues a year. I open January to March for the July issue, and then later on, maybe August to September or October for the December issue. I would like your views on that, please.
I think for me, because of the system that we use, the online platform systems, it's extremely difficult to manage the window period. I know we do put a note in, for example, during December, January, that from the 15th of December to January 15th, we would not receive or attend to any articles that are submitted. But we can't generally stop it. So what will happen is that there will be a period in which nothing will happen. And the authors will know that during this period, you submit your articles, but nothing will happen to it. But trying to stop articles, it becomes a problem. And over time, what will happen is that the authors might not want to submit to your journal.
Thanks, Libby. Phil?
Yeah, I don't have a much deeper insight than to think, hey, that's a great idea. My journals, we should also do that over Christmas. We lock it down. We haven't done that yet. But also, Betty, just in response, I want to agree. I see the papers not as we open now for the next edition, because the review process might not be done in time. But rather it's like a snowball. It's continuing over time. And some papers, they go quickly through the system, and within a couple of months, they'll be ready for publication. But some papers might get stuck in the system, maybe multiple review rounds, and it'll take a year or maybe even up to a year and a half before they get published. So it's a continuous process. It's very difficult to say, I'm going to put a hard wall down and stop it now for a certain period, because there's definitely going to be, there's momentum that needs to build up again. So you're almost stopping a machine that wasn't designed to stop. That's
very
my
helpful. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. So again, thank you to both Philip and Labi for their brilliant presentations, gave us much food for thought. Thank you for everyone for keeping a steady stream going in the chat. And I'm sure there were many questions and comments to engage with, but we don't actually have time. So we do have to hand over to Kenyan. I'm just gonna say, heavy is the head that bears the editorial crown, and much strength to you colleagues. And I'm sure it will become easier with time. Hopefully. Kenyan, I know we're very late. We've taken about 5 of your minutes, but we hand back over to you. Thank you.